first things first, we also have a demo repository that you are free to check out and poke around and play with if you would like. Either while the talk is happening or afterward. That's at our Last Call Media GitHub account at the BackstopJS-demo repo. Melissa, I don't know if you want to post the chat while you are presenting, or while I'm presenting, post that in there. Okay, and I just opened the chat window too, so cool. All right, so let's get started. This is Void Misery with the Visual Regression Testing. And Melissa, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Melissa Rossi. I am a developer at Last Call Media. I've worked on websites for over 10 years. So that's pretty much enough about me. Chelsie.
Hi, I'm Chelsie Johnston. My title is Senior Front-End Developer at Last Call Media. I have been at Last Call for about a year. I've been building websites professionally for about 8 years and as a hobbyist for a while longer. And at Last Call, I primarily, my area of interest is front-end work right now. So in this presentation, we're going to demo some ways that project teams can integrate visual regression testing using BackstopJS and explain what both of those things are. And we're going to show examples to help you get started. And we hope that at the end, you will walk away or log off away with an understanding of why you should consider implementing visual regression testing and how to use Backstop to do that. So what is visual regression testing? Visual regression testing is a type of automated testing that highlights visual changes in a web page. So this is a testing tool that is taking over for manual visual testing of web pages, comparing things with your human eyes. Instead, we're leveraging computers to do that, which is pretty neat. And if you have ever worked on CSS before, this might look like a familiar experience to you. But I want to point out here that this GIF is reflecting the experience of making a change kind of in one CSS file or wherever, and then like something else way over here breaks. But this can also be true for changes in JavaScript, changes in markup or your templating language, changes in your like PHP errors cropping up, content changes, anything that contribute to the rendering of a web page is prone to this feeling. I like it because of how relatable it is. So visual regression testing, VRT, I'm going to say VRT a lot to get around that kind of mouthful there, can be used at any stage of a project's lifecycle to help catch unintended visual changes.
So VRT protects against unwanted changes to web pages, and it's just one type of testing tool or type of testing that you can use. It is one of many. VRT can support your project teams in building effectively and with confidence. It is just another pair of eyes on your web pages and when you make changes. It's just that double check. So we're gonna kind of test you guys a little bit and test your human eye. And so in this next slide, we're gonna give you two different images. An image A and image B, there's 5 differences. And I've already given you a head start here. And we're gonna give you at least a minute to see if you can spot the 5 differences. If you get it within the minute, just put it in the chat saying you're done. And then after the minute, just put how many you found. I'm just gonna give you notice that I did not catch all of them. So, are you ready? Set?
No, you're good at this. Come on, babe.
Ready, set, go.
Okay, we got 1 minute on the clock starting now. I will add here that we looked for a good way to play like Jeopardy music here, and we couldn't find a good way to do that without the sound quality suffering.
Yeah, my
So
voice
just
wasn't up to
pretend.
it.
Okay, we've got about 30 seconds. Ten seconds. Okay, got some people finding a few, and that's been about a minute.
Okay, so, wow, okay. Here we go.
4.
Yeah. I found 4 in like 3 minutes. So, I mean, I cut that time down a little bit. So that just proves that the human eye might not catch everything. And that's why having some type of visual regression testing is always a positive for your team and everything. So how do we prevent not having these differences go out to production? Oh, I forgot the slide, sorry.
Yeah, so here they are. So whoever said fruit placement changes was correct.
Yeah.
Other slight details. So how do we prevent stuff like this? One way that we can do that is using BackstopJS. So BackstopJS is a really helpful tool that we like to use for VRT at last call, and it's pretty popular. BackstopJS is a JavaScript tool for running visual regression tests, and it's open source. It's available on GitHub at the link in the slide, or you can, and we will make the slides available after this. And you can also Google Backstop, it'll come right up. And you can install Backstop in your project or elsewhere in your build to help you identify visual changes. And it is CMS and framework agnostic, and it can be used on anything from static web pages to dynamic web apps. So it's really lightweight, it's really flexible, and because of that, it can be very useful in a wide variety of projects. So what Backstop actually does is it compares a before and an after screenshot of hypothetically 2 versions of the same thing, a before and after, and then creates a visual diff showing the changes. So here in this GIF, you can see when we click on the diff and the scrubber, highlighted down here in kind of this pink purple is a visual diff of the differences between this reference image or the before and the test or the after. So, quickly before I move on, I just want to point out that, of course, not all visual changes are bad necessarily, depending on your project. You could also use diffs like this to track visual changes and the history of what's changed, to communicate these changes with other people on your project team, etc. But I would think the most common use is to protect against unintended visual changes. So let's walk through some examples here. So hypothetically, let's say that you're working on a new site build and you're a developer and your task is to build a component called grid of cards. And grid of cards has the following requirements. It's a grid component containing 6 smaller card components, each card having a title and body text. So an assumption kind of here in this example is that we are using component theming, which means that we are building our theme out in such a way that there are smaller pieces that fit into larger pieces, and all of those pieces are reusable. So in this example, our grid of cards is this whole thing, this whole grid, and it's showing this one card template 6 times. And so it's just kind of spitting that out with the data. So it follows that whatever changes we make to the card template are also reflected in the grid of cards template. this is important later. So it's all good. You know, it's pretty easy to build grid of cards. You make some simple markup and you use CSS grid to style it so that it looks like grid, and it's fine, and you ship it. And then a couple days later, you get a new requirement, which is called Fancy Card. And Fancy Card is almost the same as the card that we just built for grid of cards, right? It still has a title and body text, but it also has some new requirements. It needs an image, it needs an author and tag data, it needs some new fancy styling, and last, it needs an alert at the top to promote something special. So since you already have a card component, which you built for grid of cards, you figure you can just improve on that, what you already have, to save time, which is great, right? So you rename the old card to basic card, and you make a new version of card called fancy card. And you give it some new styling over here in your CSS and in your template. This is Twig, but it could be anything, whatever you're using to generate markup. You add the new data and it shows up and it's great. And if you're a developer, you might be thinking, wait a minute, some of this looks strange. We need to add conditionals to make sure we're checking for this data to exist before we print an empty wrapper around the thing. Or, hey, this CSS should actually be scoped under the fancy class because we want to only affect the fancy card, and you would be right. But maybe you're a little extra tired today. Maybe you're distracted by something, you know, a coworker, you have a new request, maybe your life is just distracting today. Maybe in some capacity you're new to theming or to writing CSS. You know, any number of things could affect the way that you might approach building this. And in general, you're human. And we're all human, and humans aren't perfect 100% of the time. So maybe the timeline for building fancy card is a little tight, and you really need to get it out like yesterday. And so you submit your change and it's out of your hands and you're feeling pretty good. Except a couple days later, a stakeholder comes by your hypothetical desk or pings you on Slack and reports to you that grid of cards now looks very broken. And you look at this and you say, oh man, these are definitely the changes that I made to accommodate fancy card, you know, and they weren't supposed to be this far reaching, and I'll fix it right away. And you fix it and it's fine. But there are some issues that happened in the meantime. A breaking change went to production, a stakeholder saw it, which really I don't think any of us like when stuff like that happens. Your site and your organization, your brand, etc., maybe looked a little bit less credible to anyone who's viewing this, given that it's, you know, pretty obviously not supposed to look like this. And overall, your team had to spend time figuring out how and why the breaking change got introduced, and inevitably, sometimes who introduced it. Humans have a tendency to want to problem solve and get to the root of problems, especially when working in team settings, I think. And so I think sometimes people can't help but try to pinpoint where and who introduced something like this. So it makes sense that we would want to improve our system so that we have a safeguard in place against this happening, right? And could you as the developer have checked grid of cards while you were building fancy card? Sure. And maybe was that your responsibility? I don't know, maybe not. It depends on your project team. But it's likely that you're not actually the person who built grid of cards in the first place. Or maybe if you did know it existed, maybe if you're working on a team with multiple developers, you don't know where it's visible on the site. So you couldn't really have checked it if you wanted. And like I said, the timeline was really tight. You know, you were in a hurry, maybe you were tired, in general, human, right? So how could we have used Backstop to help us out here? Let's see what it actually looks like to run Backstop tests for the grid of cards component. So over here on the right, I've got an example snippet from backstop.json file, which is what Backstop uses to inform the way it runs its tests. And in particular, I want to point out 3 things about this. This isn't the whole file, but this is kind of the chunk that if you were to get started, you would want to know kind of what bits of this do. So up here in the viewports, this is where you can specify what viewports you want to test, and these are completely customizable. So for example, I'm just testing desktop here at 1280 by 1000 pixels, but if you wanted, you could test, and it's very common actually to test mobile, tablet, desktop, or if you're using Foundation, like small, medium, large, extra large, whatever you want, and you can test there, and it will go and have a separate scenario for each one of those. And then in the scenarios down here is where we actually specify what thing we want to test. So we have a label, grid of cards, and the reference URL is the thing we're testing against, hypothetically the thing that you want to make sure doesn't change. And then the URL here is the new version of that. So this could be your dev versus your production. It could be your local versus your dev site. It could be something else. It could really be anything. It's pretty configurable. So let's go ahead and watch. I'm going to slow this down because it goes by really fast. So I'm about to run in my command line, which is how we run backstop tests, one way to run backstop tests. I'm going to type backstop reference here. And when I do that, it's going to, and I'll pause so you can kind of see, it's going to create new reference files, meaning screenshots for each scenario that we've added to our backstop.json. You can see here we have the success. It's created one scenario grid of cards according to our label here. And now we have a test image that we can test against. So next thing I'm going to do is run backstop test. And when I do that, it's going to go to our URL here and create a PNG and of the diff, the difference. So it will open up a new browser tab and show you the results. And so here we have one failure, our one test case failed. And if we go to the failures and go to the diff, we can see that our reference, looked good. Our test is the broken version, and we can scrub back and forth between the two and clearly see what has changed. So let's look at another example. Let's say that we're working again on a new build and on a team of multiple developers. And maybe I am a project lead and I have to resolve a merge conflict between the master branch and a new feature that's coming in. So I'm looking at this and I'm trying to resolve this merge conflict between lines 17 and 18 here. So the flex wrap property in flexbox either being wrap or wrap reverse. And let's say I don't know which one is correct, and for some reason I'm not able to check with who made this. Maybe they're out that day or something, and it's, for whatever reason, I just have to make this choice. And I happen to choose line 18, flex wrap wrap reverse. So I get rid of 17, I choose wrap reverse. And what happens here is, this is the umami theme, the demo theme in Drupal 8, and it is showing a list of recipe cards here. So I run my backstop suite of tests. This is what it would look like if you had a whole bunch of scenarios and it's running them. And we've got some errors here, meaning that we do have some visual regressions. So since we chose the flexbox property that we chose, we've actually ended up reversing the order of our cards. And there's also one that looks like it's missing, but they're just in a different order. And so if you were working really quickly, or maybe if you hadn't worked on this theme a lot, or for whatever reason, this change might not be really obvious to you just from eyeballing it, right? It doesn't look obviously broken. It pretty much looks the same at a glance. And so this is something that Backstop can help catch. Whereas if you were just queuing visually by yourself, you might not get it. So I will hand it over to you, Melissa, to talk about false positives.
Yeah, so false positives and fine tuning. False positives are something that you can get from Backstop. They can come from two different things, either the page loading or a dynamic site. And when I say page loading, it's either the image, the map, anything that has to load is just not there in time for the screen to capture it. And dynamic sites, things can change. People update, people make changes to the website. So how would you prevent this? To fix page loading, there is a ready.js script or an onready.js script. It depends on what you're using. And basically you try to tell the Backstop not to take a screen capture until either the image, the map, or the font has loaded. You can also hide things, so animation, slideshows, anything like that, and you can just put almost like a covering or a placeholder over it to cover it so that it doesn't interrupt or give you a false positive. The dynamic site, a recommendation, which I have actually used in the past, which is quality assurance pages or QA pages. And that's basically just something that you create a page and have it on your production site where nobody touches it. And you can put all your components on it and you can just compare that page to use it as a baseline, basically. So we've gone over over what the Backstop is, but why would your team need to use this? And we're going to kind of give you the reasons and the benefits of using visual regression testing and Backstop in the next few slides.
So I think the main reason why it's really helpful to use visual regression testing is for efficiency. So developers who are working on teams can more effectively work separately, contributing discrete features without kind of accidentally working over each other. And you can also prevent a lot of extra time, budget, and tears spent reworking features and fixing breaking changes and bugs. I think if you've worked on any kind of project team working on a web product, you've run into some kind of regressions, and fixing them is just kind of a bummer. And it takes time, like, you know, practically it takes time, and yeah, but it's also so nice to know that you're just making forward progress instead of kind of one step forward, two steps back. Like we've already said, you can test new features, you can test breaking changes, you can use it to test releases, which is pretty neat. And just as a real life example of a time when this really helped me on a project, a couple of years ago, I was the front-end lead on a project where we had some in-house developers as well as contractor developers building a Drupal site and theme. And the devs, including myself, would frequently contribute changes that would interfere with other devs' current release cycle work or existing work in the theme. And in this case, we were working with a pattern lab instance that fed a Drupal theme. So there were actually two sort of code bases and visual sets of things to keep in check. And through no fault of anyone's, we would still undo each other's work all the time just because of the sheer like breadth of stuff that we were doing. And this is with daily stand-ups, with being constantly on Slack, you know, pinging one another all day, and even pairing, we were still communicating all the time and still running into all these issues, right? So before we implemented VRT strategically, we spent a lot of extra hours, specifically in the QA process, and then also in development, just figuring out where the changes had come from and then fixing them. And after VRT, we were able to prevent these conflicts from going into the code base or making it as far as QA. So we didn't have to do as much rework or worry about sleuthing at a point when we were on the hook for making forward progress. And Melissa, I think you also have an example.
For confidence.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so confidence kind of flows from efficiency. Using VRT allows us to have more confidence when we make changes to an existing code base or build up a new one. And it's not our fault that we make mistakes. I think I've said this, probably hitting you guys over the head with it. But this isn't meant as a dig on anyone, unless you're a team of one and you know the whole site inside and out, backwards and forwards. And even then you might make mistakes, you know? So this just takes that pressure off. And a lot of little oversights can add up to bigger problems. So if you have one visual regression that makes it through, depending on what it is, maybe that's fine and no one notices. But by the time you have 5 or 10, especially if you are a designer or UX and you have spent a lot of time, and developers too, really anyone who's spent a lot of time like crafting and really finely tuning a theme, only to have it kind of get degraded as time goes on by little things that sneak through, it can be really frustrating. And of course, you want to deliver quality. So just finding a way to protect that quality. You can also use this to show non-developers the changes that have been made and view them in multiple viewports, which is nice. And yeah, so now, Melissa, I will ask you to talk about your example.
So I had like a past experience. My former job was, we had this title, what we call a release manager, and the release manager would have to wear multiple different hats. They have to be responsible for creating a release branch, testing it, making sure there's no issues. If there is issues, fix them. And then at some point, deploy it at night to the production site. And it was a little stressful. I mean, you were in charge of making sure that you didn't break the production site. And we did not have Backstop when we first started, so, or any type of real heavy duty testing automation. So we started basically just doing it but visually checking pages and everything. And this was a huge site, so there was no way of covering all pages in any way. So basically, we added, at some point during the project, there was Backstop added to it, and it became much less stressful to be considered the release manager, or at least that person, to be creating that release branch, testing it, and knowing that what's going out into production is not going to be a breaking change or a page, like an address missing or anything like that. It was just a lot less stress, where you just kind of sat back and said, okay, I'm good. I can deploy this. Hopefully no issues. So another thing that with the confidence, you get the flexibility with Backstop. So you have the ability to use it in different ways and use it with multiple different tools. So Backstop can be used in multiple different environments. Like you can use it in production, you can use it in like a stage or testing environment, you can use it in your local environment. Some people have multi-devs and other like little dev CDs and everything environments where you can test between your productions. It can be used for static and dynamic websites. Like we talked about, dynamic websites, you can have fix those false positives with the QA pages. It also, you can do it in multiple different ways. So Docker, Lando, NPM package. So you're not like kind of set on just using it in one different way. You can also use Backstop with your CI tool. I personally have used it with Circle CI in the past. You can also use it with Jenkins and Travis. You can also, with adding it to your CI tool, you can create a great automation, and you can continuously test your code before it gets to production. So filtering for certain branches, like your release branch, your tag, you can compare your integration branches versus your production. You can test your stage environment versus production. And you can also continuously test your integration branch and you can test it like every day, certain times of the day, or when something new that you think might make a change that should not happen. So there's a lot of flexibility with it. So like I said, I've used it in the past with Circle CI, and this is a snippet of code that I actually have used, where you can actually create a job with Backstop, and using a Docker image, you are basically creating a Backstop directory and using the image and everything, and you're running a reference of production versus test, which could be your staging environment and everything. And then you can report those results to Circle CI. And basically those results can be used for, you can look at them, other people on your team can look at them, project managers, stakeholders if they wanted to, anybody could have access to those reports. That's all in the GitHub, the BackstopJS demo repo. So if you wanted to look at it, that is just the job though. You would have to add it to a workflow, and you also would have to adjust the report, just an FYI, to add CI for Circle CI. Jenkins, Travis, there is some examples in Backstop where I think it's Travis or Jenkins, I can't remember, sorry. But there's examples of how to use it and add it to those CI tools. So if you guys want to add your questions to the chat window, and I'm going to do some conclusion, and then we'll start answering as many questions as we can. Just to conclude, we have gone over visual regression testing and Backstop, the benefits of using VRT and Backstop with your team, and hopefully you have gotten some insight on how to use and set up Backstop within your own projects. I saw the chat and it said, oh, I have so many questions. Sorry. But we'll answer as many questions, but Chelsie, can you add that other slide? There is, if we can't get to everybody's question, there is a regression testing channel in Slack under Nerd, where you can join us and we can answer as many questions there as well. And let's try to see if we can answer some questions here, Chelsie.
Sure. So first question, do you recommend storing references in the same repository as the project which you are testing? If you don't keep them with the repository, where would you keep them? That's a great question. In the past, I personally have worked on project teams where we've stored references in the repository, with the caveat that that bit of the repository can get pretty big and unwieldy. Usually it's not a problem, but just to consider, if you don't like having a bunch of PNGs in your repo, it's also possible to to basically generate your references every time, providing that you have a static source that you're testing against. So if that makes sense. So hypothetically, like if you have a version, like a one prior version, you could set that to be a reference, and the script could continuously use that as a reference and just generate that anytime it's running. But I think, it feels to me like the standard practice would be to keep the references in the repository. I don't know, Melissa, do you have any?
I personally don't use the references. We don't store them in the repositories. But with the Circle CI, the artifacts and everything, those can be, if you're using the automation, those can be kept there. It really depends on your team and the makeup of your team and how you would want your workflow to work, if you want to keep all those. And it also depends on how many pages you are comparing as well with your references versus your tests.
Right.
So that might be a bigger question for your team, if anything.
I think that's kind of, that goes for just about every part of this. And I think that as I'm thinking about it more, Melissa, what you said about whether or not you're using it as part of automation, I think is a factor in whether you would keep your references in the repository. And I think this is a difference between the way that you and I have used it, right? Because the way that I've used it a lot is actually running it locally before. So we used to have a step as part of our PR review that you would, if you're reviewing someone else's PR, you have to run VRT that would run Backstop against the reference image that the developer who made the PR put in there. And you have to run that, and then you have to merge in master and then run it again. So there's kind of a couple steps of checks there. And that wouldn't really have worked without the references being in the repository, because that was work that hadn't been released to an environment yet. But if it's something that's, you're using Circle or whatever CI and you're comparing environments, there's not really a need to store those references anywhere. Shall I move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Cool. So James is asking, is there a way to ignore a specific change from triggering an error? Meaning, would it allow an automated deployment to continue if a wanted change would happen? Assuming you set backstop errors to cause a break to the deployment process. Good question.
Yeah, there is something in that snippet. It says the when always, so it would continue on. So yeah, right there. So even though there's this failures and everything, it would continue on with whatever's left in your jobs or in the workflow and everything. It really, don't think it would actually stop anything unless you set it to fail completely on Circle CI, from what I remember. But I would have to just double check that, James. I'm sorry. I usually have Backstop running as the last item on my workflow, so it's not to interrupt the workflow at all. But there is, like I said, if it's something that that might cause a false positive, similar to a false positive, there is workarounds where you can just hide it, maybe with the ready.js script, where you can just say, just don't look at this, cover it with a placeholder. And so there is other workarounds you could do if it did cause the Circle CI to just stop.
Yeah, so I didn't quite point this out in the backstop.json. And of course, if you go to the Backstop repository, there's documentation about all of this. But you can specify your on before and on ready scripts here. If you're using the Docker implementation that's in the demo repo, it'll look a little bit different, but basically you can do whatever you want in this file. Like Melissa was saying, add a placeholder or swap things out. You can also hide selectors. So this would, I think, apply visibility hidden to any selectors that you know are a problem. For example, let's not test any iframes because those are unpredictable or whatever it is. You can also remove them from the DOM. I think this will set them to display none. There's also controls for hovering and clicking things. If you want to test some of the more interactive behaviors in the browser. And yeah, so there's a mismatch threshold, which you can raise or lower depending on how granular you want to get. So maybe, for example, maybe hypothetically, you don't care about a 5-pixel difference in padding, but you do care about a giant glaring PHP error that comes up. You might set that a little bit higher or whatever you want. like we've been saying, it's so configurable that really it all comes down to your project team and your project. Any more questions before we end? We've got about a minute more in the room. I think we end at 45. What scale of tests, from Les, what scale of tests do you find yourself performing? Do you mostly test small visual components, or are you mostly testing full templates pages that integrate all of these? That's an awesome question. I'm going to quickly rush through an answer. In the past, we've tested entire pattern libraries. So for example, a whole pattern lab instance. And if you look in the demo repo, there's actually a way that it's set up where you can specify, I think it's a JSON object with individual like patterns for things that it can test. So you don't have to add individual scenarios for each one, although you certainly could. You can also have that go out and hit all pages under a certain like directory, basically. So like yoursite.com/admissions or whatever, you could hit anything under that. So but like Melissa said in one of the slides, you can also have it test like a dummy or a QA page that has all of the things inside of it. So I've definitely found it helpful to test smaller components as well as larger things that include all the components.
And you can sometimes do both too, like with the ready.js with the backstop-docker that is set up in that demo repo. There's a way of actually also testing the full page, but also doing the selector at the same time. So like you get a result for just that selector, as well as the full page on top of it. So you have a lot of flexibility with Backstop. And I personally started with just full pages, and that's probably me being the backend developer probably. But as Chelsie said, components and all that stuff, I learned from her. So.
Which is cool because we both had used it like with pretty good success, but in pretty much totally different ways. So, okay, we are going to end. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and stay safe and have a good weekend.